All right, so atoms have a fixed number of protons. Neutrons can be moved to form different isotopes. And when we move electrons, we're going to form chemical bonds. So now we're going to look at the valence shells of atoms and see how electrons can either be shared or transferred to result in two atoms that stay chemically attracted to each other in the form of a chemical bond. The first type of bond we're going to look at are covalent bonds. Covalent equals sharing. Sometimes the sharing is done equally, sometimes the sharing is done unequally, but either way, the two atoms are going to share their electrons. So here you can see two electron cloud models. When these two hydrogen models are not bonded, you can see that this one has one electron and this one has one electron. As they get closer to each other, you can see the electrons kind of spending more time over here. And then eventually we see what happens is the electron shells kind of overlap and they share. So these are so close to each other that they essentially have the use of both of the electrons. And since the outer shell of hydrogen, the valence shell, only holds two electrons, now it's happy. Two hydrogens together, so this H2 molecule, is how hydrogen gas exists in nature because this is its happiest form. When we share one single pair of electrons, we often write it like this. That is a single covalent bond. Oxygen can share two pairs of electrons, and that is going to typically form a double bond. Nitrogen gas is, so this is N2, and this exists normally in nature as a gas in the atmosphere, and this actually has a triple bond, which is very hard to break. Plants and animals are not even able to break this bond. We have to rely on special bacteria to get nitrogen out of the air into a usable form. You can see several examples of bonds formed here. So this hydrogen is sharing only one pair. You can see the oxygen here sharing two. And then here we see oxygen bonded with hydrogen, where it's sharing one pair with each of those hydrogens. So there's a single bond here, and there's a single bond here. And then carbon, which remember was missing 4 electrons in its outermost shell, here you can see bonded to 4 hydrogens. So each hydrogen needs 1 extra, and each carbon needs 4. So if the carbon shares 1 electron each with each hydrogen, then it is going to be happy if it surrounds itself with 4 hydrogens. But different atoms are attracted to electrons in varying degrees. So I like to think of this as electron greediness. So electronegativity is how greedy are you for electrons, right? How much do you love electrons? The more electronegative, the more you attract electrons. So there are a few key players. And this is an electronegativity periodic table. You do not need to memorize this or learn any of these numbers, but there are a few that you could kind of recognize. Notice that the noble gases, which are totally non-reactive, they're not electronegative at all because they don't care about electrons. Their electron shell for valence shell is full, they're happy. Everybody else over here needs a few electrons. So hydrogen comes in at about 2.1, carbon comes out at about 2.5. So the lowest shelf down here, we've got hydrogen and carbon, they're approximately equal. They're pretty low in comparison to the other molecules that we're going to generally look at. Nitrogen, you can see, is about a 3, so it's a little bit higher. It's definitely going to attract them stronger than a hydrogen or a carbon. Stairs. Those are pretty good. All right, the highest step is oxygen with my 3.5. This is very electronegative. The actual highest one is fluorine, but we don't talk a lot about fluorine. We're going to mostly focus on oxygen. Oxygen is extremely electronegative. It is the most greedy for electrons besides fluorine, and it is going to pull them away. So the electrons are going to move in the direction of the most electronegative because they attract them the most. So how does this affect a covalent bond? If we're sharing electrons, are we going to share them equally? So here's a water molecule. And remember what we said, oxygen was much more electronegative than hydrogen. If we have an oxygen molecule, the electrons are going to tend to spend more time around the oxygen than the hydrogen. They're going to be pulled in here towards the oxygen. What charge do electrons have? Right, electrons are negative. So that means we've got electrons with a negative charge spending more time being drawn in closer to this oxygen. So we end up with this delta negative. So delta is a Greek letter for partial in this case. So oxygen has a delta negative partial negative charge. Hydrogen is slightly positive. Hydrogen is spending less time with these negative electrons. The electrons are very much attracted to the oxygen, not so much the hydrogen. So the hydrogens end up with this partial positive charge. So this is called a polar covalent bond. So this right here is a polar covalent bond. Polar, if you think about a magnet, right here, a magnet has a positive end and a negative end. Thus, we kind of have a gradient or a polar field. This is the same thing over here. Overwhelmingly, we have a negative pole and a positive pole. The positive is over here by the hydrogens. The negative is over here by the oxygen. So between them, we have a polar molecule. So a polar covalent bond causes it to be a polar molecule. A nonpolar covalent bond is anytime the atoms are going to share equally. This is because the electronegativity is about equal. So this happens with anything when it shares with itself. So hydrogen to hydrogen, oxygen to oxygen, nitrogen to nitrogen. Those are all going to be nonpolar because if you think about it, the electronegativity of hydrogen is the same as the electronegativity of hydrogen. And so they're both going to pull on the electrons the same strength. So the electrons are going to end up right in the middle. This also is the case for carbon and hydrogen bonds. Carbon is a little bit stronger than hydrogen, but not so much that it really matters. So overwhelmingly, carbon-hydrogen bonds end up being non-polar as well, meaning that the electrons are shared right in the middle and there's no negative or positive ends. The next type of strong bond is called an ionic bond. And this is when electrons are transferred from one molecule to the other. So a good example of this is table salt, sodium, and chlorine. So you can see the molecular structure of sodium down here. And sodium has 1, 2, 10, 11 electrons. So there's 2 in the first shell, 8 in the second shell, and only 1 in the third shell. So think back, how many electrons belong in the third shell? Well, the third shell needs 8 to be full. So sodium is nowhere near full, and it's not going to conceivably be able to attract 7 electrons. Its electronegativity is pretty low. Instead, what it's going to do is it's actually going to give its electron to a different molecule. So chlorine has an atomic number of 17. It has 17 electrons. So 2 in the first shell, 8 in the second, and then 7 in the third. And it is only missing being full in that third shell by 1 electron. So when sodium and chlorine get together, sodium gives up an electron to chlorine, and they're both happy. Sodium ends up with a full valence shell, and chlorine ends up with a full valence shell. That makes them now chemically inert. They're happy, they're good. The difference is that sodium lost an electron. Remember, electrons are negative, so when I lose an electron with a negative charge, I end up with a molecule with an overall positive charge because it now has 11 protons, but only 10 electrons. Same thing's going to happen over here. We result in an ion with a negative charge called an anion, and that is because chlorine has 17 protons, but now has 18 negative electrons, and so this is going to have a negative charge. And the reason they form an ionic bond is because negative and positive are attracted to each other. So now this positive sodium and this negative chlorine are going to stay together. That attraction of the anion and the cation is called an ionic bond. So ionic compounds, this is a compound, we've got sodium and chlorine found in fixed amounts, are typically called salts, and salts such as table salt are usually found in nature as crystals. And they're crystals because they form a very organized structure, where the sodiums are always next to the chlorines, and the chlorines are always next to the sodiums, and so they crystallize into an organized structure. So covalent and ionic are our very strong chemical bonds, but we also have some weak chemical reactions that are important. And even though they're weak, they're really important for these large biological molecules. So this is a strand of DNA, which I would hope you could argue is an important large biological molecule. And in the center, we've got our nucleotides, A, T, G, C. And if you look here, these are held together by hydrogen bonds. Each individual hydrogen bond is very weak, but overwhelmingly, enough of them put together are very strong. A lot of weak things can make something very strong. It also gives them a nice reversibility. It means that it's easy to come in here and break apart a small section of DNA. I can come in here, copy that DNA, and then they can go right back together. So I don't need to pull apart an entire DNA strand to use it. I can just open up a little bit and then let it go back together afterwards. So polar covalent bonds allow hydrogen bonds to form. Right? Go write this in your notes, say it to yourself. Polar covalent bonds allow hydrogen bonds to form. Go all the way back to polar covalent bonds. Right? Here we've got an ammonia. This is a nitrogen bonded to some hydrogens. Nitrogen is more electronegative than hydrogen, so the electrons get pulled towards the nitrogen. We end up with a partial negative, partial positive. Same thing for water here. We have that partial negative, partial positive. So when this water molecule gets next to the ammonia, the positive hydrogen is going to orient with this negative nitrogen. This also happens with water and water. So I could draw another water molecule here. There's my oxygen, hydrogen, hydrogen. My partially negative oxygen is going to want to be next to my partially positive hydrogens. The electronegative molecule is almost always going to be oxygen or nitrogen. So if you see those bonded to hydrogen, you should be aware that that is a polar covalent bond. So here, 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 those are all polar covalent bonds inside of a molecule. This and this are the hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds form between molecules, right? So we have this entire water molecule bonded to this entire ammonia molecule. And the only reason they form is because those molecules are inherently polar because of their polar covalent bonds. So this is something that you should expect on the exam. This is a highly likely contender for an essay question on the exam as to how polar covalent bonds contribute to the formation of hydrogen bonds. Another weak interaction here is the van der Waals interaction. or this is kind of similar to a hydrogen bond in that it's taking advantage of small partial charges just due to the random movement of electrons. So if you look at this gecko, it's got these toe pads here with these little ridges all the way up its little hand here. And these ridges create a huge surface area for teeny tiny little hairs. And all along these hairs, we have small movements of electrons. And just because the electrons are not evenly distributed, you in any one time will have kind of partial negative areas and partial positive areas. And so when this gecko climbs a wall, its body weight is so light and these attractive forces are so frequent. They're very weak, but there's a ton of them because there's a huge surface area of gecko toe pad hairs that it's actually able to hold up this higher body weight on the wall just due to the random uneven distributions of electrons in your wall and the gecko toe pad hair. Here we can see that theme of shape implying function. So a molecular shape is extremely important to its function. How a molecule interacts with neighboring chemicals and molecules is going to determine what it does. This is how biological molecules recognize each other. So this is a brain cell, and these are the endorphin receptors. So this is a natural endorphin, the hormone, that when you're excited and you're having a fight or flight or stress response, you would release endorphins. This would also happen if you're just running and exercising. And these get sent to the brain and your brain receives them. And if you're running, like, this is a good feeling. This is what gives you a runner's high. Look at morphine. Morphine is a chemical, an opioid drug that we use for pain reduction. And it has an active area right here that looks exactly the same as natural endorphin. So it's got this region that's exactly the same. And that region is right where the brain cell receives it. So endorphins are known to shut out pain, right? If you're running away from a bear and you've got your endorphins running, you don't really care if you stepped on a stick and your toe hurts. You just want to get away from the bear. Morphine does the same thing. It tells your body not to worry about the pain. It actually shuts off your body's recognition of the pain. And so we use these opioid drugs, which has caused a whole opioid crisis of drug overuse, as a way of mimicking natural biological opioids to help reduce pain from things like surgery, which is one common way that people get addicted to opioids in the first place, is they have some kind of medical procedure done and then get prescribed something like morphine. So as we go through this class, we are definitely going to look at several chemical reactions, and a chemical reaction is going to occur anytime we make and break chemical bonds. So anytime you make one bond, you're going to end up breaking another bond. The reactants are what you use in the beginning. Those are your ingredients. They are typically before the arrow. The products are what you produce, right? You produce a product. That's going to be at the end. That's your end product. They are usually after some kind of arrow. So in this case, we have two H2 molecules and one O2. We're going to break all of these bonds, and then we're going to form new bonds to form two water molecules. This is a chemically balanced equation. We have two H2, so 1, 2, 3, 4 hydrogens over here, 1, 2, 3, 4 hydrogens over here. If you're in chemistry, you are definitely going to be doing balancing chemical equations. I'm not going to worry about that so much in here because I'm not focused on the chemistry of it down the road. All chemical reactions are reversible. So a reaction that is reversible or is doing both the forward and backward reaction will often be drawn with kind of this forward and backward arrow. If a reaction is only moving forward, we might just draw it with the forward arrow if it's really only, or if it's moving forward much faster than the reverse reaction. This forward-backward arrow is an indication of something that's in chemical equilibrium. So chemical equilibrium is something that gets a little bit misunderstood. It does not mean that there has to be the same number of reactants as products. The reaction we had before was H2 plus O2 goes to H2O. So it doesn't mean that we're going to have 3 of these and 3 of these and 3 of these. That's not balance, that's not equilibrium, that's not like a thing. What a chemical equilibrium does mean is that they stabilize at some ratio. So what we saw in the previous situation is we had 2H2 plus O2 results in 2H2O. And it's going to stabilize in this ratio of 2 to 1 to 2. So this is a chemical reaction that's at equilibrium, where the forward reaction and the backward reaction can occur at the same rate.